A law is moving through Congress to finally make radio stations pay musicians for their work. But while the bill aims for fairness, many independent artists are watching its progress with a specific kind of dread. For decades, terrestrial radio was the closest thing the music business had to an ignition switch. One spin in the right market could move records, wake up labels, and turn a local act into a real conversation. Because radio held that power, broadcasters maintained a unique legal advantage. Traditional over-the-air stations pay songwriters, but pay zero performance royalties to the featured artists. They argued that airplay was free promotion, a logic known as the exposure excuse. That excuse relied on the monopoly that no longer exists. With the rise of streaming, social media, and systems like Apple CarPlay, radio is no longer the primary gatekeeper. The U.S. Copyright Office has formally noted that as consumers move away from music ownership, the exposure argument is no longer enough to justify a zero royalty rate for performers. Congress is now attempting to fill that gap with the American Music Fairness Act, or AMFA. This bill is designed to pull AM and FM radio into a framework where they finally pay performers for their sound recordings. The legislation amends copyright law so that owners have the exclusive right to perform their work publicly by means of any audio transmission, effectively closing the loophole for over-the-air broadcasts. The legislation requires the copyright royalty judges to establish binding rates and terms for these broadcasts, forcing the rate-setting machinery to engage as soon as the law is enacted. On a macroeconomic level, this appears to be a straightforward correction of a long-standing imbalance in how artists are compensated. But the reaction from many independent musicians is defined by a strange paradox. They see the bill passing and fear it could dismantle the very pathways they use to reach an audience. This chart shows financial protections for smaller broadcasters. Stations under $100,000 in revenue pay just $10 a year, and public stations are capped at $500. So the direct cost isn't the worry. The true danger lies in the bureaucratic weight required to manage this new system. Commercial radio today functions as a carefully managed risk system, where broadcasters rely on consultants, focus groups, and call-out research to ensure they play songs already familiar to their audience. The only places still willing to take risks on unproven music are at the edges of the dial. College and community stations operate largely on volunteers and shoestring budgets, with many running on less than $100,000 a year. For the average indie artist, these fragile stations aren't just a part of the industry, they are vital cultural infrastructure required for scene building. Usage-based rights only turn into checks when usage is accurately identified. A right to be paid doesn't help if the music is played but never reported. Reporting requires strict compliance. Stations must log the track, artist, and ISRC while submitting audience data to a collective like SoundExchange. But if the artist hasn't maintained accurate metadata, the system cannot match the spin, and the royalty never reaches them. There is a massive gap between these high-tech reporting requirements and the reality of a community station run by volunteers using aging analog equipment. The true threat to these stations isn't the annual fee, it's the friction of complex reporting, a burden that could force small stations to become even more cautious and narrow their programming to avoid the risk of a paperwork error. Fragile cultural institutions rarely disappear in a single moment. They are worn down by cumulative pressure. One more system to manage, one more certification to file, and one more compliance rule to follow. To manage this new pressure, volunteer-driven stations may begin to mirror the behavior of corporate radio, taking fewer chances on niche music and sticking to safer, easier-to-track playlists. Congress is attempting to correct a real injustice by making corporate broadcasters pay their fair share, but they risk accidentally suffocating the micro ecosystem that supports independent music. If the bill fails to account for this friction, indie artists may win the moral principle of fair pay while losing the last human doorway on the radio dial that treats them like culture instead of content. For a deeper analysis of the American Music Fairness Act and tools for navigating the modern music economy, visit Making a Scene.